now it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers, Professor Michael Taylor of the University of the West Indies. Professor Taylor, who is also participating in the SRMGI Global Forum, teaches in the Department of Physics at the University of West Indies, Mona, in Jamaica. He also served as the head of the Department of Physics from 2009 to 2016 and is currently the Deputy Dean for the Faculty of Science and Technology. His research interest is in the area of Caribbean climate science, including climate variability and climate change. Professor Taylor has been the director of the Climate Studies Group of MONA, the CSGM, since 2007. The CSGM plays a leading role in coordinating and producing climate research related to the Caribbean region, which, as you all know, has been in the news quite a bit over the last months. Their work has been incorporated into several reports for CARICOM governments, including for reporting purposes to the UNFCCC. Professor Taylor is well published and serves on a number of national and regional climate-related boards and panels. And today, Professor Taylor will give us a talk on climate change and the Caribbean. Important takeaway messages. Professor Taylor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me just start by quickly saying thank you very much to the organizers of the conference for the invitation. I really consider it an honor and a privilege. I think my role here today is to set a little context, and it's a context about climate change as viewed through the lens of the Caribbean. As you have heard, the conversation about climate change and the Caribbean has in the past few weeks become significantly louder. And it has become significantly louder because of the passage of not one, but two Category 5 hurricanes, those being Irma and Maria, which followed the same path and over some tiny islands of the Eastern Caribbean. It's not really that the conversation on climate change was not taking place before in the Caribbean, but in the wake of the kind of scenes of devastation that were left in the wake of these two hurricanes, that conversation has been greatly amplified, clearly making them audible alongside other conversations of immediate and pressing importance for Caribbean existence. There are in fact two interesting things about the conversation that is taking place now in the Caribbean about climate change post-Irma and post-Maria. The first interesting thing I would want to say is the range of people participating in the conversation. Usually, a conversation about climate change in the Caribbean would involve very few people, just climate scientists like me, who would be fighting to get the climate change message across. Rather, in this kind of post-Irma and Maria era, the range of people participating has greatly expanded and includes prime ministers and government actors, private sector, financiers, planners, disaster responders, the media, public sector workers, adults, male, female, and just ordinary people like you and me. If there is perhaps then one good thing that we might say has come out of the bad of this, is that climate change has gotten the sustained attention of many people, and that is noteworthy. But perhaps the second noteworthy thing is not just the range of people talking about climate change now, but it's actually the range of topics that are being discussed. And it's not just limited to the storms and what was unusual about them, their ferocity, the ability to maintain their intensity for days on end. Rather, that conversation has now been extended to look on past climates, future climates, attribution, losses, damage, recovery, restitution, adaptation, prevention, resilience, survival. In other words, the range of the discussion is notable because it now takes the discussion on climate change in the Caribbean from being a science issue to being a human issue. I think then the challenge then for us in the Caribbean is to see what are the key messages that we can distill from the range of voices and the range of themes, so that after this hurricane season has passed, can we draw them as key lessons? I want to suggest that there are in fact three simple takeaway messages, which I think that the Caribbean and the wider global community can take away in this post-Irma and Maria conversation. So in other words, when climate change is viewed through the lens of the Caribbean and considered in the context of the Caribbean reality, perhaps these are the three messages that are coming home, three takeaway messages. What quickly then are these three takeaway messages? Well, takeaway message one is this: simply take notice, our climate is changing. Takeaway message one, take notice, our climate is changing. So one of the common threads of the conversation is the notion that our climate is just absolutely not behaving as it is used to. In the Caribbean, the historical climate records would support this message. So, though we're used to being hot, if we look on the number of really, really hot days in a year, as signified by the diagram in the top, you can see that it's increasing. And same for the number of really, really hot nights in the year. And so the impression is, of course, that we're having earlier summers and longer summers. And it's not just that it's getting hotter, but if we look on rainfall records, the total rainfall may not suggest an overall drying or wetting, but the character of rain seems to be changing. And so what we get is an increase in both the consecutive dry days and intense rainfall events. Put it another way, so there are longer dry spells, but when it rains, it rains. Sea levels are also rising at roughly the global average and taking with them valuable shorelines and beautiful beaches, which are the important elements to the tourism product of the region. And then there seemingly has been an increase in extreme events, including prolonged droughts and the tropical storms and intense hurricane activity, though climate change may not be the only thing playing a role in the latter instance. But I think you get the idea that I'm trying to bring across. In tandem, there seems to be a strong case that there is something unfamiliar about the climate today in the Caribbean. I know the question that's going through your mind. It is simply this: so what? So what if there is something unfamiliar about the climate today in the Caribbean? Well, in the context of the Caribbean, the problem with the unfamiliar is it is really that daily existence in the Caribbean is very sensitive to climate variations, and as such is strongly dependent on familiar patterns of climate. It's fair to say that life in the Caribbean really revolves around climate. So on the one hand, daily life is structured to take advantage of these mean climate conditions and ambient climate conditions. So life by design or by default occurs outdoor. But if life occurs outdoors, then this makes the average Caribbean person, whether they be a tourist, tourism worker, a Caribbean farmer, a sportsman, security personnel, or even a student, among the emerging class of climate vulnerable in the newer, unfamiliar, and an unexpected environment of hotter temperatures. On the other hand, this is not the only reason for climate sensitivity, because the economies of the region are also premised on industries and sectors, example, tourism and agriculture, which are extremely sensitive to climate variation. And so too are the quality of life indicators such as water availability and health and well-being. So in a good climate here, which follows mean expected patterns and pulls no surprises, there's favorable economic growth and noticeable improvements in standards of living. And when the weather is bad, even up until now, there has been a familiarity with how bad it can become, and that is accounted for. For, as predominantly island states, most of our infrastructure and population centers are inevitably sited only a few kilometers from the shore, making them highly vulnerable to extreme weather events. Up until now, even the newer regional infrastructures could withstand the ravages of hurricanes and tropical storms, as we have seen from Irma and Maria. No more. I think the point I'm trying to make is this: that as the climate change seems to be quickly heralding in an era characterized by unfamiliarity, the strong sensitivity of the region to climate, and this sensitivity in part defines Caribbean life, is quickly being transformed into a vulnerability. If we allow this to go unnoticed, it has the clear potential to significantly erode Caribbean life, the way of life, the standard of life, and the quality of life. It's for this reason, then, I think, that the very first simple takeaway message is this: take notice. Our climate is changing, and with that change comes the challenge of the unfamiliar. But I suggested there were 3 takeaway messages. If the first takeaway message is take notice, our climate is changing, and with that comes the challenge of the unfamiliar. Then the second takeaway message hinges on the scientific projection for the Caribbean, and I sum it up with this very simple diagram. If you take models and plus scenarios, you get future projections. When you look on the future projections for the Caribbean, you get the second takeaway message, and it is this: take account of the fact that our climate will continue to change. And the future Caribbean climate will look a lot different than it will look today. So very quickly, if we, on unabated greenhouse gas emissions, look at what the Caribbean will look like at the end of the century, it may look something like this. In the first instance, a very hot Caribbean, irrespective of scenario, whether the better case scenario at the bottom or the worst case at the top, will be even hotter. Probably a further 2 or 3 degrees over the 1 degree warming already seen, with up to 98% of all days hot by current standards. The rainfall will continue to be variable, but it will vary about a lower threshold, as rainfall amounts will decrease by up to 40%, and during the months when rainfall is normally expected, posing a significant challenge to already water-stressed Caribbean territories. Sea levels will continue to rise, probably by a further 1 to 2 meters, removing parts of some of our islands, and far exceeding the rise already recorded. And frighteningly, the frequency of tropical Atlantic hurricanes of the highest intensities will increase, or are projected to increase, though not necessarily the frequency of hurricanes overall. I think cumulatively, the science of projection suggests that the region's climate will be so significantly altered, it will look nothing like anything we are currently used to, as it will be outside the bounds of our lived experience to date. What am I saying? It will not just be unfamiliar, but it is likely to be unprecedented. And I know the question that I think is going through your mind, that it is simply, so what? So what if it should be unprecedented? Well, in the context of the Caribbean, unprecedented climate will likely lead to unprecedented impacts, which have the potential now not just to erode the Caribbean way of life, but rather to set back or defer Caribbean development dreams. With every facet of Caribbean life being so climate sensitive, every facet will be impacted in significant ways. And perhaps this is the major lesson from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Though the stocktaking is hardly complete, at least for Barbuda, Dominica, Puerto Rico, the setback to their economies will likely be measured in years, as the initial estimates for rebuilding are of staggering proportions. Perhaps even more heartbreaking, however, is the loss of those things that are economically unquantifiable. The drastic reductions in the standards of living, especially for the most vulnerable. The loss of irreplaceable culture and cultural assets. The mental anguish and loss of lives, the loss of biodiversity, and the undermining of achievements already made in the pursuit of sustainable development. Does this portend the future challenge that unprecedented climate change represents for the Caribbean region? Let me put it another way. For the Caribbean not to account for future climate change would be making a mockery of its commitments to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, because it would make them unattainable, as climate would keep pushing the goalpost further and further away. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that with climate change comes a potential heralding in of an era characterized not just by the unfamiliar, but by the unprecedented. For the Caribbean, the need to account for the coming climate challenge becomes even more acute if the rate at which the era of the unprecedented is being ushered in outstrips the rate at which the region can prepare for its onset. In that kind of context, here is the dilemma we face: figuring out how to contend with the unfamiliar now while preparing for the unprecedented that is to come. I think then you can see why my second takeaway message about climate change, when viewed through the lens of the Caribbean or considered in the context of the Caribbean reality, is simply this: take account of the fact that our climate will continue to change, for with it comes the challenge of the unprecedented. So finally, 3 simple takeaway messages. If the first is take notice our climate is changing, and we must notice because of the challenge of the unfamiliar. And if the second is take account of the fact that our climate will continue to change, because with it comes the challenge of the unprecedented. Then the third is embarrassingly simple. That third takeaway message must be, take action. Our climate demands change. You can see where I get this. For the unfamiliar demands that we change our current attitude to climate, we must take notice of what climate is already doing. While the potential for the unprecedented demands we change our approach to development planning, we must take account for what climate can do. The third message then is that, simply this, that our climate conversation has to move beyond acknowledgement and consideration to action, an action which is characterized by urgency. The need is for action, and for action now. In the Caribbean, I think that action that needs to be taken becomes clearer with each climate change manifestation. So we know in the Caribbean that there is need to explore mitigation, options to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations, including the use of renewable energy, targeting preservation of forests, and tackling waste. These all represent win-win considerations for the Caribbean anyway, even if there were no climate change. We know in the Caribbean that we must implement appropriate adaptation strategies. And these adaptation strategies are aimed at reducing the climate sensitivity of critical sectors and areas of life. In particular, we have to target water availability in the future of less rainfall, sustainable agriculture in a harsher physical environment, tourism which benefits from but is not entirely dependent on natural assets, health which is more resistant to climate variation, and coastal infrastructure which can withstand unprecedented weather extremes. There's also the immediate need in the Caribbean, we know, for enhanced public education about climate change and its impact, which targets knowledge sharing and behavioral change, and which uses all possible fora to reach all possible ages. In tandem, all 3 actions will lead to a climate-resilient Caribbean. Yet, even if the region had all the necessary resources to take all these actions, in the end, its future viability will be to a large extent premised on collective global action, which drastically and quickly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, thereby delaying the worst impacts of climate change. It is here then that the challenge of urgency comes into play. It is for this reason that I think you know that the Caribbean and other small island developing states have argued and lobbied for 1.5 degrees to be the limit of mean global warming in the current century. And they use a very catchy slogan, 1.5 to stay alive. There is need to act now if it is to be at all achievable. Of course, whatever global action is taken in this regard must bear in mind the inequities of the past that have gotten us to this point. And so it must be guided by some principles, including but not limited to being impactful but sensitive, transformative but just, acknowledging both responsibility and responsibilities, being inclusive and not prescriptive, being timely and not imposed. And it is within these boundaries that I suggest that the discussions of this conference must take place. When climate change is, however, considered in the context of the Caribbean reality and viewed through the lens of the Caribbean, I think you can see why the third takeaway message is simple, and it is, take action. Our climate demands change. We must respond to the challenge posed with urgency. So in closing, I note that what is driving the conversation about climate change in the Caribbean now, for Irma and Maria have passed a couple weeks, is a regional sense of unease, because in truth we still have 2 months to go in the current hurricane season, and therefore the capacity exists for this to be an even more record-breaking season than has already been. When climate change is viewed through the lens of the Caribbean, and in the context of the Caribbean reality, the lessons seem pretty clear. For the Caribbean, those lessons suggest that the unfamiliar is already a challenge. The unprecedented will likely be too much of a challenge. And so global urgency in purpose and action that goes even beyond the Paris Agreement is our only real hope. I leave you then with the 3 takeaway messages about climate change, which perhaps you can take away from the Caribbean's contemplation of this issue, which I think have relevance for everybody. Take notice, our climate is changing. It comes with the challenge of the unfamiliar. Take account, our climate will continue to change. It comes with the challenge of the unprecedented. And take action. Our climate demands change. This is the challenge of urgency. Thank you very much.